whatever you love, you'll need to tie it to something adaptive so that it can exist in the future and promote whatever it is you wanted promoted. Whatever else you care about, if you care about it in the future, you need to care about adaptiveness. You need to give natural selection its due, find ways to compromise to be adaptive, to let your descendants and the things you love and will carry the things you love go on. Those things need to be adaptive. So you must think about how you and your society can be adaptive so that it will be there in the future. Like if you wanted AIs to love, but AIs won't be created until the next civilization makes AIs. Well, guess what? You'll need to have something that lasts until that next civilization that then gives AIs love. Otherwise, you won't get a vote because your kind of people will go away and they won't be there later to speak for the things you value.
This is Dan Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. This is our 16th episode of the Worthy Successor series with none other than Robin Hanson. Robin Hanson is a thinker who's been exploring the ideas of posthuman intelligence between mind uploads and AGI for over a decade longer than most of the folks that are in the dialogue today. He's someone who I've enjoyed following the evolution of his thought over the years in the past. In this episode, he dives into his suppositions about what a worthy progression forward for AGI would be, or posthuman intelligence. He refers to kind of the word descendants oftentimes in this episode, which I think is a nice touch. And he kind of goes in suspecting that maybe he's not touching on the main point because he's bringing up this point you're going to hear over and over again about natural selection sort of being a degree of primacy and survival being a degree of primacy, when in fact that's nail on the head. And sort of by about a third of the way into the interview, we're really diving into his conception of adaptiveness and why it is so primary in the intelligence that will extend beyond us. I have a lot of thoughts. As usual, I will save them to the end of this episode. Without further ado, let's fly in. This is Robin Hanson here on The Trajectory. So Robin, thanks for being here.
Hello. Nice to see you again.
Absolutely. It's been a little bit.
2.5 years, you say, since we talked again?
Exactly, since our last conversation. And a handful of things have happened since then in the world.
Strikingly. It was roughly 3 years ago when the large language model boom took off.
Exactly. Yeah.
And now, presumably when we talked before, we were only 6 months into that boom, trying to think about where it would go. And now we've seen 3 years of it. So I think we are better able to guess roughly where it's going.
Yes, more to unpack. And I think a lot of people were really interested in, you're talking to Robin, here's some questions. And I was like, some of those actually would be great to know. So yes, just kind of recent update stuff. Some people were asking, we're going to get right into the Worthy Successor questions, but just for kind of backdrop, you've written a good deal, and we've spoken a little bit about some of the respective, let's call them advantages of maybe the EMS approach to developing intelligence and other substrates versus what we've seen thus far in the world of artificial intelligence. Now, of course, Robin, LLMs is one paradigm. I fully expect many other paradigms of AI to evolve. I do not expect this to be the end of the game. But relatively speaking, in terms of your perspective of sort of where EMS level capability would be stronger and where sort of you're seeing AI blossom and maybe early proto AGI, if we're getting anywhere close to that blossom, any initial thoughts on the respective strengths and weaknesses there that's changed for you in the last 3 years?
Well, the highest level question that people always had was just, is this it? We've had these every 30 years, roughly, bursts of concern and interest in automation and artificial intelligence going way, way back. And each time people say to themselves, well, is this it? Is this the time when AI is basically going to do most everything, take most of the jobs, to make the big, huge change, right? And that's the most prominent question on people's minds every time. And that's, of course, on people's minds this time. So when we talked last, it was right after this big burst of a new dramatic improvement. And that was definitely on a lot of people's minds. And so then the key question was, how general is this? Like, is this a new tool that can do a new range of things, but still not the whole range of things we need done? Or can this do the whole range, properly modified? And I'd say, 2.5 years ago, it was more an open question. My guess was it would be more like the previous cycles.
Yeah.
Where it couldn't do everything, but it was going to be a nice improvement over what we could do before, and we would now have a new range of applications we hadn't had feasible before. But it wouldn't be the thing that made AI take over everything. Now I think 2.5 years later, I can be more sure about that judgment.
Yeah.
I am. It's just we've seen a more consistent pattern of the capabilities and what they can do and what they can't, and that suggests that okay, yes, we are more able to see roughly what this sort of thing can do.
And clearly, it's not like every accountant is out of a job, every call center person is out of a job, right? We're certainly not there. And there's some adoption culture challenges. There's obviously some technological challenges, memory challenges with these sorts of systems, et cetera. And this kind of ties into people wondering your thoughts around, hey, I've heard Robin say something like, maybe actually AGI that could sort of really just replace what humans do, maybe everything from plumbing to accounting, still being maybe a century out. I let him know, like, okay, I'll bounce that off, Robin. Any initial thoughts for you? You kind of look at where this wave has gone. Obviously not super impressive for you in terms of economic disbursement here.
Right. Well, that's my main criteria is when will AI take over human jobs wholesale?
Yes.
That's the thing that has a huge social impact.
Absolutely.
And obviously it's great to have technology short of that, and hopefully we'll find uses for it. But that's one benchmark. Another benchmark now is, can AI justify the investment?
Yes.
So we've got, several $1 trillion worth of investment piling up
This is
here.
very different since you and I chatted
revenue,
last, right?
a factor of 100 less.
Yeah.
And the question is, will the revenue grow to justify the investment? That's obviously a business gamble that's going on. And that's another threshold to think about in terms of, because if people come to the consensus that the revenue doesn't justify the investment, there'll be a retrenchment. It'll be temporary, and then eventually the technology will still spread, just like with the internet and other previous bursts and waves. But still, that's another benchmark we could think about. Do we think this will be more or less than what the markets are expecting? Yeah.
Well, so let me ask. I'll just put a thumbtack in the timeline thing, and then I do want to go exactly where you're going. You're reading my mind here. Still for you, kind of ballparkish, I think your suspicion of non-FOOM at the dawn of LLMs was seemingly rather correct, right? I mean, we're not seeing the grand takeoff. I think we are seeing some impressive stuff around video and other things, but the wholesale replacement of human jobs, per your core criteria, doesn't seem as though we're ramping. Are you still ballparking a century-esque for that grander takeoff? I think a lot of people are hoping, actually, we have that much time. Is that still your suspicion, or any new thoughts around that?
So I actually think we have this other problem accumulating, in particular a fertility problem. And my default expectation with that problem is that world population will peak in roughly 30 years from now and then decline plausibly over several centuries.
Yes.
And as a result, innovation will grind to a halt.
Yes, there's this innovation.
So there's a deadline of innovation here. So if you just expected continued exponential expansion, you'll have to slow down your expectations for this event. Now, if we can develop AI before this deadline, then AI can replace the human population that wouldn't be there, and we could have continued exponential growth. But if human level AI isn't achieved before that deadline, we could have a several centuries lull where there was relatively little innovation, and then a new civilization rises again and then can take up the cause and eventually achieve human level AI. So that to me is a key threshold. And I've estimated roughly that it's roughly 70 years equivalent of continued exponential growth, roughly what we'll have in the integral of this rise and then slow decline for a long time.
So you think we've got another 7 decades, even we'll peak in 30 years, but even another 40 years after that, probably still see the kind of GDP expansion.
Well, it's 70 years equivalent. That's the integral under this curve that spreads out into centuries.
Okay.
And so the rate at which we would achieve that 7 years would take longer than 7 years, but still that's roughly the amount of innovation that we would have left before the fall.
That's a fun metric.
And so the question is human level AI achievable within that deadline?
Yeah. Well, I there's so much to unpack there. What's your instinct? Looking at where things are now, looking where money's being invested, looking at the
it's a toss-up. So I'm really struck by the fact that all through this history, whenever we had a new burst of AI, It was just actually hard to tell how far the new technology could go. So fundamentally, we just don't have a very good theory of what it takes for us to think. We can identify some things that are our mental skills, then we make a new AI technology based on that, and then we're not actually sure, could that do everything? And then what we keep finding is, well, no, that couldn't do everything. And here's another set of skills the brains have, and we're going to automate that. And then we wonder, could that do everything? So we just have all these different capabilities that our brains have that we haven't known what they are. And that's just what happened every time. So now we're at this point, we say, well, okay, that looks pretty cool. Could that do everything? And you realize you just never knew before.
Yeah.
How would you know now? You just don't know all the things that happen in your brain. That's the key point. Your brain is really capable. It can do a lot of stuff. And you just have very poor idea of how to scope out and draw a limit around what that is.
Yeah. It reminds me of the early days of expert systems. It was like, well, you could just apply this to vision problems. No problem. Right. Early days of robotics. We learned proprioception was like unbearably complicated when it was like, how come we can't get robots to catch a fucking baseball? Right. It was like, why is this so hard? And then it's like, oh, there's another set of things. And of course, you hear now, Robin, people saying, well, maybe everything is just word prediction. Maybe you could do plumbing with word prediction if you translate the visual. But to your point, often we make these suppositions and then we realize there's entire paradigms to blow through and new challenges to overcome.
Right. So my default is that we just don't know. And so I will just take the prior of however many of these things we've seen so far, the chance of the next one is 1 divided by the number of those. Right. If we see 5 of these so far, I don't think you can believe that the next one has more than a 1 in 5 chance, really, of being the one.
Yeah.
So the more of them you see, the more you expect to see, really.
Yeah.
And so that would be my rough statistics. Now, you could say that's the highest estimate. You might have other reasons to think it's even harder than that. But that would be, if you're just looking at the stats, you might say, if you've seen 5 of these so far, if thinking the next one has a 50-50 shot, you have to think, a fair bit about, hey, we've gone through most of what we can do and we're almost there. I don't think I know that. So I'm going to have to say, if I've seen 5 so far, then I'm going to guess there's on average another 5. So the next one has a 1 in 5 chance.
I think that is a fair way to think. I think it's really hard to argue with that reasoning. And I think to say that any new paradigm will be the crack to the totality of intelligent activity does feel increasingly challenging as we go through more and more.
Many people have the reasonable point to say, look, if there's even a 20% chance the next one is it, we should be setting ourselves up to deal with that possibility. And absolutely, we could talk about how to ensure against the problems that it would happen if it turned out to be the one.
Yeah. You brought up this population decrease. There's more uncouth things to be said about this, but I'll frame it in extremely couth terms. Some people are fearful of potentially kind of a runway on idiocracy, if you will, and sort of like how long until countries that seem to be like high functioning and full of people that are reasonably intellectually competent are sort of like maybe not as high functioning and sort of competent. So in other words, it's not just like 8 billion people, no matter what, equals X amount of innovation. Like that actually might be sort of wrong.
Sure.
Some people are wary that, there may be an innovation cliff and sort of the infrastructure upon which are new sciences and paradigms of computer science and neuroscience, et cetera, if those get crumbly and we lose big chunks of it or make no more progress on big chunks of it, then there may be a trough of who knows what kind of length. And you've talked about this in the past, is there any nuance on that tension for you? As you said, it's a bit of a toss and we don't know. There's 1 in 5, 1 in 7. How many of these paradigms do we need? How long do we have for this to be reasonable? What do you think people should be thinking about and doing with relation to that runway problem?
So the next one, or even this one, could be the one, and we should be prepared for that possibility. But we should also be prepared for the possibility that it isn't.
Yeah.
And then we ask, if we don't get human-level AI, how do things play out? So there's a lot of things to say about it. One is, when exactly does innovation peak? if the world isn't uniform with respect to its innovation capacities, then when population peaks, Africa is still rising while the rest of the world is falling at that point. So the question is, what's the innovation capacity of Africa compared to the rest of the world?
Yeah.
If it's less, then innovation would peak before population peaks, you see, meaning that we'd have less of this innovation before we run out.
Or do we to presume that Zimbabwe will magically become South Korea? These are open questions, right?
Right. So you could worry that, in fact, innovation will peak sooner than population will peak, and therefore there'll be less total innovation. I think as the world shrinks, I think a thing that will happen is that computer hardware, which is intrinsically durable, has not actually been made durable so far because new generations appear so rapidly. But in a declining economy, we will realize that it makes sense to make a durable generation of computer hardware. And then once you've made that, you'll just turn off the factories and not make any more for centuries. That is, in a declining population, you won't be getting much new, better software. You won't be able to make the hardware better, but you could just make a generation of durable hardware that could last for centuries. The hardware itself could last for centuries if you just would make it so. So that would be a gap in the sense that once we turn off the computer hardware making machines and we have this set of long-lived machines that we're just going to keep using, that will make it much harder. I mean, that will mean, until we revive that later, we're not going to get AGI, right?
Yeah.
That would sort of be a sign that we had admitted that we're done for now. And that we're going to go through this
stasis.
centuries-long period before it rises again. Another thing to realize is that plausibly the main cause of liberality in the world has been the fact that liberal countries were innovative and therefore powerful, and the rest of the world said, look, if we want to be powerful and compete militarily, economically with these top countries, we need to be liberal too.
Meiji Restoration, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, but once innovation stops, they won't need to be liberal to keep up, so the pressure to be liberal will go away.
Yeah.
And I think the world just won't be liberal anymore.
That I haven't ever heard it framed that way, but it seems wildly plausible. I mean, how long would Japan still have been swords and ox carts? Were it not for Colonel Perry or what have, or Commodore Perry. These are sincere open questions. China had made the decision at that time to sort of stay closed off and paid the price, but then since then, of course, has risen back. To your point, why even? Right? Why not just fall into some other pattern? Because we don't have to level up in any appreciable way. And then is there even ever a point of a takeoff where the grand process of life can unfold to something higher if we end up in a trough of that kind?
So with no human level AI or brain emulations, both plausibly might not be achieved before this fall, our main world-shared monoculture would decline, and the next civilization that rose up, again, would not be our civilization. It would not share our culture. Yeah. And if you are greedy or eager to influence the culture of AI, you should want to influence the culture that gives rise to AI, human-level AI, and that won't be us if it happens after the decline. So you were going to tell me about, ask me about AI and what's worthy.
We're going to get there.
The whole worthy AI discussion is kind of academic if we're not the people who decide that. It's the next civilization.
Yeah, well, I mean, this kind of highlights the point of maybe doing our best to escape such a trough from which we know not if we could bubble out of. Again.
Right, and I'm happy to spend a lot of time, because that's what I've been focused on the last 2 years, is
cool.
Trying to think about how to prevent this fall and what its causes are, that sort of thing. But you have some other topics you want to go to. We'll make sure we get there first. But that has been my focus.
The end of the whole episode, we're going to basically just focus on those levers, by the way. But in the near term, as we lead into that, and we are going to unpack a hell of a lot of that, Robin. So your last 2 years of thinking, we're excited about. A lot of folks are sort of seeing, as you had just mentioned, the degree of investment be 100x. What we're seeing for revenues. Now, of course, in my opinion, a financial singularity was always to precede a technological one. In other words, so first an ambition singularity, that is to say anybody with a reasonable head on their shoulders who is interested in power would hurl themselves entirely at either creating or controlling the deity, right? That would be the only thing you'd really focus on. And of course, now, Robin, we see all the billionaires of note are essentially doing this. A good preponderance of them, I would say. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying I'm telling you what I'm observing. And then the financial singularity follows the ambition singularity because the most ambitious, powerful people are throwing the most money at it. But people sort of look at this and say, man, it's not like maybe it'll cause a tragic AI winter, but it seems like there could be a crash that's pretty gigantic if we're not actually seeing this stuff turn back around in terms of productivity. When you look forward, I would never ask you to time the damn market. I don't ask anybody for that. But you see this investment money, you see the froth that is coming up, and you know the prize. The prize is very big. You understand the prize better than most. But you're skeptical that we're going to take this swing of the baseball is going to be the one that gets the home run. How should people be thinking about this wild degree of investment, all these data centers, all these trillions?
There have been bets in the past where, like when a nation bets a war and you lose and the enemy comes in and loots and burns down the countryside,
yeah,
everybody is in on that bet, even if the elites are the ones who chose it, right?
Yep.
So in those sorts of situations, you should be jealous or wary of letting elites decide these things. In our world today, however, when rich people make a big financial gamble on something like AI and it doesn't work out, they're the ones who mainly lose, not the rest of us. So that's good. They have more to lose, and that's a good feature of capitalism. That is
absolutely. So your I guess your suspicion is, hey, look, if the stock market, like, of course, the stock market is being propped up by the companies that are pursuing the sand god. And so more or less, right? And now, unlike 2-3 years ago, they're all actually just saying it outright. I think they all knew the ball game half a decade ago, but
we don't know how much they believe it, but they know it's good marketing.
I guess I suspect. I mean, some of them occasionally do little, what I think of as like cries for help about like the fact that actually like this stuff could get kind of scary. Some people would say that's marketing as well, and it's a perfectly fine opinion. Either way, the dollars are really getting frothed in there. I guess what you're getting at is, hey, if they swing at the baseball and this isn't it, and they end up really taking a crazy hit, maybe the stock market itself, kind of propped up by their companies, will also take a hit. But everybody that puts money into the S&P 500, they know it's going to go up and down. And it's like, that's not the same as getting your country looted by a general that screwed up your town.
We saw, this dot-com crash in 2000.
Yes.
But it didn't crash the economy.
No.
2008 was when the economy crashed because of, mortgage-backed securities.
Yeah.
If you take the dot-com boom as your example, the non-investors are fine. It's more, well, what if it wins and then we don't get as big a share? I think that's the envy a lot of people have.
Absolutely.
How could we let the billionaires take most of the wins from this big gamble they're taking? We apparently don't mind them swinging and missing and losing a lot of money. But if they swing and hit it and make a lot of money, now we're all going, but that was mine. That was mine. I should have had some of that.
Such is the self-interest of man, as you know better than most. And people, of course, aren't even aware of that self-serving bias, which emerges sort of in all walks of life. So I guess to your point here, what we're seeing for investment is what capitalism does. It might be a pretty big wave that crashes in a specific way. The people that are mostly throwing those chips on the table are going to be the ones that pay the price. And c'est la vie. There will be other businesses that come about. If we don't have chatbots that magically solve for all call centers, someone else will make something that's still innovative and will be able to kind of carry forth. Like the process won't be fundamentally harmed.
Now, there are a lot of people who have the same fear that people have had for several centuries and now, that is the capitalists will somehow like do something nefarious to like crush and enslave everyone or whatever. They're afraid of like a monopoly that runs all of AI and,
Yeah, sure.
And those are just fears about capitalism that go way back, and they haven't been realized that much. If you look at the history of capitalism, it's not like that, but there remains a deep fear in many people's minds that any big change could be a change in the regime of capitalism. And one of the images they have about capitalism where capitalists just take over everything and like enslave everybody.
Yeah. And I guess, I had Toby Ord on a little while ago. He sort of talked about how, well, if like the actual productive stuff within your nation isn't actually coming from the populace, then maybe you do actually have to listen a little bit less to them once you cross a certain threshold. And there could be governance dynamics that actually get a little bit less sympathetic, assuming the bulk of the value is not created by hominids with opposable thumbs. But we're not around, we don't appear to be around the corner from that tomorrow. And it sounds like for you, those kinds of fears now of this tyrannical takeover, pretty unwarranted.
I mean, what many people do is they try to translate their fears of capitalism to a fear of governance. And we do, in fact, have less confidence in governance. Governance has gone more badly in the past. And it's quite possible that we could have bad governance in the future. I'm less sure that this would cause the bad governance than just that bad governance is possible.
Yes.
But as you know, I have invented a form of governance that I am hopeful could be a great improvement over existing ones. And I think independent of AI, we should just be pursuing that. But if you think there are fears of governance disasters or hellholes in the future, then you should be all the more eager to innovate on governance so that we have better governance mechanisms.
I would concur. You're certainly not the only person that thinks like, geez, should the structure change? And we're going to get to a lot of that when we get to the end of the interview in terms of recommendations. So we're building our way up to that. With that said, Robin, I'd love to get into the meat and potatoes of the episode and build into some of those insights I know you're going to be able to share with us. The core question of the Worthy Successor series, the same with Bostrom, Levin, Peter Singer, the whole kit and caboodle that's been here, is basically if at some point in the future, and you and I have chatted a little bit about our descendants going off and doing things. And of course, we're being nondescript because we don't know what they'd be doing precisely. But I think for you, that it seems like you've got a bit of a cosmic take in the sense of it seems neato that the flatworms bubbled up to you and I having a Zoom call right now. And it would feel neato if that process didn't stop with us. I mean, in fact, you seem pretty overt about not wanting any kind of collapse of this unraveling kind of unstoppable sort of process, or what like change is unstoppable. Progress maybe is. If you were able to look down in some future, who cares how long it is, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, doesn't matter. There's no more opposable thumbs. So you and I are not walking around going fishing, walking our dogs, whatever. There's no more humans. But what you see seems to you to be the kind of like unraveling of good, seems like a good outcome from where human society was, like let's say today, to, what human society is today to when there were only single-celled organisms in little ponds, however many billions of years ago. What would, if you were to look down and see something and say, man, it looks like it's actually worked out pretty well. Like, what would that be for you?
I wish I knew.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in so much as you can. Of course, everybody's been kind of vague, rightfully so.
This is actually a key Achilles heel of humanity. Maybe it won't be of our descendants, but the way humans were constructed, we actually just don't know what we want.
Absolutely.
We are endowed with a lot of habits, to want sex and food and things like that. We were built with this hodgepodge of motivations that in the past induced us to, survive and grow even. And we understand that we're the result of a natural selection process, which tends to produce things that are adaptive.
Yes.
And we can expect that at least up until recently, we were adaptive in our environment, that we had been selected to be adaptive, and therefore that this hodgepodge of motivations would, in effect, make us grow and continue and thrive compared to competitors.
Yes.
Now, if you say, yeah, but what do you really want? It turns out you don't know. You just see you have this hodgepodge of motivations and feelings that show up in different contexts. And if you look at their details, they're often inconsistent with each other and in conflict.
A mess.
And you really just don't know. And more fundamentally, you know that you are the result of a cultural evolution process, not just a DNA evolution process that has been slowly editing this and varying and changing the packages on which things we value more highly. And you are the result of that. And you know that you look back even just 500 years or 1,000 years ago, certainly 10,000 years ago, you can look at your ancestors and the package of values they had, and they were really quite different than yours.
Absolutely.
And so
yeah.
what you value, to the extent you can even see it, is changing rapidly over time. And you can tell that your particular package is kind of random.
Oh, absolutely.
It's kind of a sort of random gamble evolution took to like see what might work. And it's this long-term process that was trying to make things that were adaptive, but you are not some well-tuned optimum of that process. You are kind of a random sample of some
and you neither,
guesses
chap.
about what
you
would
neither,
work.
chap, right?
Okay, so that makes it a problem looking forward to the future.
Sure
like
does.
Many people even say, look, I like what I like, and I want the world to be what I like. And so if I look in the future and I think that my descendants might change and like other things, I'll go, well, I don't want that. That's not good. I want to like what I like, and I want the future to like what I like, and I want the future to continue to be like me, liking what I like. A lot of people have that attitude toward the future. Now, obviously, if people in the past had that ability and power, they would have prevented us from changing to what we have become now. They would have made us be like they were back then.
Absolutely.
They did not have that power. And no one up until this point has had that power. But some people today think, yeah, but we should try to make that power because we want to make sure the future doesn't change from what we are to be something else. We like who we are.
I love all the strings you're pulling on. In my opinion, you are pulling on the most important strings. And Robin, just to be clear, I have had people on the show, not hyper frequently, but who have said things like, yes, this particular, like, I think the things you're talking about, how were my values different from my descendants? And please correct me if I'm misreading you here, but like, okay, I don't know, everything from sex before marriage to what language I speak to, do I like chocolate ice cream versus whatever? A certain number of great grandparents back, they never had chocolate ice cream. They don't know if they like that. There's all these little hoo-ha arbitrary things. So I think the question is, beyond the hoo-ha arbitrary things, if you were to look forward to our descendants and in some appreciable way say, you know what, this worked out well, I am not expecting you to say, Dan, they value these 3 virtues that I really like that Aristotle wrote about. Or, Dan, they wear their collars with a button on them. I'm not expecting that. What are the meta properties of the descendants beyond us that you would say, I think this worked out, regardless of how their specific favorite flavor of ice cream?
At the highest level, I have to say that everything that I am and everything that I love, including the concepts I use to love what I love, was all created by natural selection.
Yeah.
That is the only source of any of the things around us that any of us value. Now,
I'm with you.
There are multiple versions that are in conflict, so we have different things that evolution gave different ones of us that we then fight over. But all the things we're fighting over came from natural selection, just through different paths.
Yes.
So the idea that I should reject natural selection at this point and say, no, there's some other principle that I'm going to adhere to, I find it hard to do that. That is, if this is really the source of everything I value,
yes,
and I like where we are now compared to where we were in the past. I like the path that I say, look at the path we've come on. It looks like an improvement to me down this path. I admire and like and really happy with and inspired by this improvement we've seen. That makes me want to let it continue.
Yeah.
Natural selection continued to evolve more sophisticated creatures with more complicated technologies, more insight into various aspects of the world, and to see where that can go. Because the one thing I could be the most sure of is that if that continues, it will become grand, it will become complex, sophisticated, and grand in the sense of occupying large fractions of the universe, having control over vast capacities and energies and powers, with great insight and understanding of enormous things. I can predict that. Now, you might say, yeah, but is that ethical? Is that good? And I'm going to go, what do I have to choose that from? I don't know where I'm supposed to get that from.
It is possible that among all advocates for that position, I am among the strongest. So I'm totally with you. Let me put some color on it and see if you concur with where I'm going. So I concur. I think to look within ourselves, Robin, and say, oh, this this value shimmers forth to me. Surely this is sacred and ought to be sacred forever. This strikes me as actually very presumptive and probably wrong. And most of the things, when we shine a light within ourselves, we're just looking at some ossified artifact installed in us through the genetic or cultural processes that you've talked about. I think that here's a frame, like Spinoza writes about the conatus, which is the impetus for something to persist, an organization to persist. Living things seem to have conatus. And conatus behooves itself with potentia, which is the total set of powers to not die. That is flight, that is sight, that is verbal communication, that is the technologies we've developed. That's every possible thing. That's knowledge of nature. As you and I have learned more about nature, we can manipulate in different ways and have better lives and go to Mars and whatever the case may be. So things that want to persist expand their potentia to continually behoove their persistence. And as that potentia have expanded, it is bumped into what feels like value. So Robin, right now, I presume you are sentient. Now, I don't know for sure. I know I am. I don't know if you are, but you've always struck me as a pretty sentient.
I don't even think you know if you are.
Maybe I don't. Either way, look,
but you think you are. You definitely believe you are.
What I can promise you is this. At least from my vantage point, if somebody held me down right now and hit me with like a burning hot poker, I'd probably scream. So I know at least that much.
Absolutely.
And if you put a bowl of chocolate ice cream in front of me, I'm probably going to eat it. So those things I feel pretty salient about the pain-pleasure axis. That sentience seems to have bubbled up from the same evolutionary process you just talked about. In other words, the conatus wanted to expand its powers. One of its powers was simulating the world in its skull to find prey and kill it, or to escape from predators, or whatever the case may be.
So I know a lot of our listeners, maybe even the majority, will respond by basically saying, yeah, evolution gave me my life and it gave me what I am, but I'm still free to value what I want, and therefore if I choose to value gender equality or
whatever
or open inquiry or whatever it is, then I just get to choose that. And if evolution doesn't like it, to hell with it. It's what I want. That's what a lot of people will say. And there's a sense to which they say, look, value is just a fundamental thing. Once I have my values, nothing else can shake it. And there's a sense in which that's true. Here's my compromise pitch.
All right.
I would say, okay, you care about something. Do you care about that thing existing in the future? If you don't care about the future, I don't have any, I can't move you. But if you care about the future, if you say you like gender equality, you like open inquiry, you like respect, you like love, you like, creativity.
Yes.
If you like those things, do you want the future to have them? Or is it okay if they go away and there's trillions of years without them?
Yes.
And you're the last generation that has them? Or did you want them to exist in the future? Because if you wanted them to exist in the future and natural selection continues, the only way they will exist in the future is if they get packaged with something adaptive. Natural selection promotes and grows adaptive things and kills off maladaptive
100%.
things. That's what it does.
100%.
Whatever you love, you'll need to tie it to something adaptive so that it can exist in the future and promote whatever it is you wanted promoted.
Exactly it.
That's my pitch, is to say, whatever else you care about, if you care about it in the future, you need to care about adaptiveness. You need to give natural selection its due, find ways to compromise to be adaptive, to let your descendants and the things you love and will carry the things you love go on. Those things need to be adaptive. So you must think about how you and your society can be adaptive so that it will be there in the future. Like if you wanted AIs to love, but AIs won't be created until the next civilization makes AIs. Well, guess what? You'll need to have something that lasts until that next civilization that then gives AIs love. Otherwise, you won't get a vote because your kind of people will go away and they won't be there later to speak for the things you value.
I love this idea of a compromise. And Robin, in all seriousness, this is like the common sense of the entire book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, is this. And sort of like in business, so let's just say, Robin, for me, in business, having profit margin is actually pretty fucking important, as it turns out, right? Go figure. It's a
whatever
wild
else you
discovery.
wanted to do in business. If you run out of money, you can't do it.
Everything's toast. So what do you? So man, I value salespeople that really take into account the profit margin of what they sell. Well, if I value that, what I should do is tie it to something adaptive, such as if what you sell has 80% margin, you get this commission cut instead of the regular commission cut, right? You get some pop.
Right.
And so only by baking that in, I could count on people with such virtue that they inherently aligned all of their behavior to what was better for the bottom line. But actually, as it turns out, like, they also have Conatus Robin. It seems to me as though everybody has Conatus Robin. And so they're probably going to do what behooves them and sort of what works for them. And so in business, there is no choice but to do like think about
another thing to just say about all the creatures around you were built by natural selection to be adaptive. So
of course,
if there's opaque parts of them you don't understand, you should guess that they kind of are adaptive and that they will in fact respond to incentives on average in order to achieve adaptive purposes. And therefore,
absolutely,
you can't just pretend adaptiveness has nothing to do with the people around you or their behavior. You'll, and even yourself, you'll have to make peace with this idea of being adaptive in your own behavior so that you and your descendants can last and actually have a vote later on when it matters.
I think this is really crucial. I'm going to tie this to a couple ideas, see how you resonate with some of the past guests, other thinkers I really respect. This notion of if you value something, you've got to tie it to something adaptive if you want it to persist. I think that's a wonderful, like you had said, it's kind of a middle step, or I don't forget how you framed it, but I consider it a pretty empowering perspective, actually. If you want to breathe your values into the future, then think about how to do X, and X would be adaptive. Richard Sutton on the show, one of our earliest Worthy Successors, had said something like, nature is like constantly changing and beckoning its creatures to like become whatever they must become to sort of exist and persist and whatnot. And it's presumptive. He was actually like a little bit like firm about this. It's really presumptive for humans to stomp their foot and say, nope, all of the future has to be X. Like for him, going with that Heraclitean river, that constant flux and flow, and finding a way to adapt, persist, and expand within that is like the mandate, and escaping it is childish. You seem to be agreeing.
If they could actually do it, it wouldn't be so presumptive. The presumption is thinking they can.
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
That is, if humans today could coordinate well enough to decide on some values and then actually make sure that we all consistently promoted it into the future, including preventing things from competing with it, why then, I guess it wouldn't be presumptive to have that value and pursue it because you were actually capable of doing so. But we aren't at that point now. You can have these people who say they want to promote these values, but they're not in a system that will do that. They are in a cultural evolution competitive process that will not reward that. And until they change that process to something else, merely saying that's what they want to do won't achieve it.
I completely agree. And it seems to me, Robin, even if somehow we could all become little clones and embody one particular 21st century virtue, and you and I both know, Robin, give it 10 years, the norms of, coastal American values will shift in another, 2 decades or whatever if we get that much time. So to ossify, even if it were possible to ossify it, if eventually we ran into aliens, maybe they'd be grabby even, Robin. If we were to run into aliens at some point or some other kinds of intelligence, it actually wouldn't seem all that self-evident that ossified process would be good for our own persistence in that future.
So in that sense, you could at most have this controlled world that pursued the values we want for maybe 1 billion years until other aliens showed up.
Yeah.
That's roughly how long you could do it. But you might value that. You might say, look, I was prepared to only pursue my values for another 100 years before it went away. If you give me 1 billion years, well, okay, I'm, 10 million times more happy. But I don't even think anybody's really ready to make that happen for 1 billion years today. We're not really close to that. It's just not on the table.
No, and I also would say, to me, Robin, it would be, and I actually guess that this is your instinct. I don't know for sure, but my guess is it is. I would consider it frivolous and like seemingly not self-evidently right. In other words, I would actually consider it kind of wrong to sort of take the grand process of life, the flame of life that sort of exists in the biosphere now will soon exist in other substrates we might presume, whether uploaded or AGI or what have you. That this whole process should be kind of like turn into a little garden that like we really make sure has less of a chance of persisting in the very long term, just to exemplify some little short-term benefit. Like it strikes me almost like countries that like print money for everybody.
I might not like it, but look, so
yeah, go ahead.
A lot of intellectuals take the stance that what we should first decide on is what values we agree on. And then once we figure out what values we agree on, then we will sit down and be policy analysis, trying to figure out some institutional arrangement that will achieve those values.
Yeah.
As if for any set of values we could agree on, there would be some institutional arrangement we could find and implement that would in fact achieve those values. And that's what reasonable policy is. It's reasonable people coming together to decide first on their values and then to implement policy that will achieve it. I would say we're just a long way from that as a description of our world. That is, the sorts of elites who would get together and agree on these values are just not actually that representative of the world. They do not have the backing of the world to support them. That is, the world won't give them the power to implement whatever institutions they want to do to implement these things. And even if they gave them the power, they don't have the capacity. They don't know how to make a governance system that would in fact achieve their values. We are not at the point where that is a feasible thing. So,
I mean, and it doesn't strike me that we ever necessarily will. I mean, not that, I'm maybe not as far away from all modes of standards and governance as maybe some are, but to the logic you just articulated, I think there is some sort of like shoveling against the tide kind of stuff with that, right? And so,
I would say more strongly, like, there are people who say, look, we are at the height of a civilization. We've been growing all this time. We are more and more capacity. We've overcome war. We've overcome, global warming. We've overcome all these inequality. They want to celebrate how far we've come and how great we have achieved as a civilization. And now we are on the threshold of creating AI, and we together can decide what kind of AI we want and implement that and make the future the way we want.
Yeah.
And I would say you're actually near the peak of your civilization. It's about to fall. You're at the risk of not having much influence on the future at all, because the thing that will set the future is the next descendant civilization, not you.
Yes.
You should focus on how to save your civilization from crashing and have then maybe some influence over the future in a minimal way, not this maximal decide everything way. You are at risk of losing it all, guys. You are not at the peak where you think you are.
I wildly agree with this. So the way I frame this often as an analogy, we're going to keep double clicking on this because there's so much to unpack here. I would say it seems to me as if self-creation, you've said natural selection. I think about self-creation because to be really frank with you, Robin, I suspect there will be mechanisms of what we call natural selection that don't involve guanine at all. In other words, there will be ways for powers to bubble and select and test and fail and win.
Guanine? Sorry, what's guanine?
One of the four components of DNA.
That hasn't been true for 10,000 years. I mean, for the last 10,000 years, guanine hasn't been an important part of our natural selection process.
Oh, yeah, sure. What I'm getting at is like, I foresee some people think of natural selection on evolutionary timescales exclusively. I think you're using it in a non-substrate dependent way. What I'm telling you is I agree with that.
But the idea of cultural evolution is this idea that humanity has pioneered a new form of natural selection that's much faster and much more flexible.
Yes.
It's no longer tied to DNA. And it's the thing that's been driving this very rapid change that we've seen around us. We are on evolutionary timescales. We are seeing evolution play out rapidly in front of our eyes. This is natural selection.
I hyper concur. So some people push back on these ideas and they say, no, humans aren't going to change until 100,000 years when, but I'm with you. The way I see it is potentia used to unravel through guanine, and then potentia started to unravel through culture and technology. And presumably, Robin, let me be real scary here. Presumably, there are magazines of kinds of unraveling that are vastly faster than one you and I are experiencing that are to be birthed. And that will speed things up even farther. As there was only single-celled organisms for, 1.5 billion years.
Absolutely.
It's like shit be moving faster. So with that said, I'm with you, and I just want the audience to know, I guess, like, the frame we're coming from. So with that stated, there's been people like Martin Rees, who was on the show, who essentially said, I presume I know where you would concur with him, and I happen to very much be with you in terms of the continual unraveling of potentia. Martin said, basically, I'd want to see, if humans are no longer here, I would hope to see things as grand and complex as human civilization would be to, like, a nematode if it could appreciate it. I would want to see like that and probably not understand almost any of it. And he said a second thing, I would hope that some of it be sentient, and maybe sentient in a way that's kind of nice. Because if it's just zero sentience anymore, yeah, go on. I presume you agree with the first part, maybe disagree with sentience?
I gave you the story of compromise. I said, if you want anything to last into the future, you'll need to tie it to stuff that's adaptive.
Yes.
So
And I agree with you.
to be my intro into, you asked me the previous question, what do I want? What will I value?
Yes.
And so the way I want to answer the question is to say, I think I won't have very much influence. I think I need to pick the one or two things that I would most try to pass on to the future, then try to tie myself or connect myself to adaptive systems, and then maybe only promote those one or two things because those are my values. So
love it.
If I'm going to pick one thing and give it a name, I'm going to call it open inquiry. I am an academic intellectual. I like the world of open inquiry. It didn't always exist until a few centuries ago. Most inquiry was closed and hidden because authorities wouldn't allow it. We are now in an unusual era of open inquiry where we are figuring out many things together. It won't necessarily last into this less liberal era that might come in the fall.
Yeah.
It might not be the sort of thing that, so for example, in the Roman Empire, the Christians took over by doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries. That's how they took over. And at the moment, there are the Amish and Haredim who are basically doubling every 20 years. And the Amish have been doing it for a century. And that's my default scenario for who takes over. And they don't value open inquiry. There's other things we have, but they don't value it. So the risk is the civilization that replaced us will not value open inquiry. And that's the thing I am most motivated to try to save, because I realize I can't save very much. We can't save very much. We need to only save a few things and tie them to the rest of an adaptive structure so that it can last. And that might be my pick. But you don't have to pick that very thing. But the point is, you can't pick very much. You'll have to pick a very limited set of priorities and think, I'm going to try to push for this. I'm not sure how adaptive it is, but I hope that it can last because I cherish it. But I don't get very many of those. I don't get to pick the whole future civilization and all of its values about everything. I might have a thing, but if the future is as complicated and fantastically powerful as you picture, and it has open inquiry, well, now think of all the things it's going to figure out. Think about what a spectacular world of open inquiry that would be.
Yeah. So, okay, it'd be super hard for me to agree more with what you've been saying for the last 20 minutes. So, I do think this there are so few levers we can tap, and if we do, it's got to be adaptive. If you boil me down to one, I simply want the flame to keep spreading. We are a torch, Robin. You and I, we're torches. Right. There have been other torches smaller than we. May there be a grander blaze of the total number of powers, access to nature, and experience that unfurls.
To the extent that's at risk, I agree with you. That's an even higher priority than open inquiry.
Numero uno.
Is to make sure we don't collapse and stop growing, right?
Yes.
But to the extent that we could grow a lot and then there are different versions of what we became when we grow, then I have these other preferences. But, that's secondary to the making sure it grows.
I don't know. So one of two things must be the case. Either you say this in the world in a way that's different than I, or you don't talk a lot about this, because what you're saying right now is flatly quite cosmic. In other words, there will be things beyond us. Nothing stays the same. You are a great believer in Heraclitus and in the Conatus. You're a great, you've written a book essentially about the Conatus and the elephant mind. When I articulate this notion, that sort of the primacy here must be the continuance of the flame. And yes, we ought discern values and things that matter, but really the system itself, the great process of life ought continue to unfold and flourish, lest we have no values whatsoever. When I say these things, I have very mean and angry things hurled back at me. Do you see the same? Do you frame it in a friendlier way? I don't know.
So I think Thomas Sowell once had a book about the constrained vision. And he said he was trying to describe the left versus the right in his world 35 years ago, or whenever it was, as saying, on the left, people don't think the future is very constrained. They think they can make it whatever they want to. If they describe a future, they could make it that way. And he thought his associates intellectually saw constraints. They saw constrained human nature. They saw economic and sort of organizational constraints. And whether or not that's a good description of left versus right, I find it, something I can embrace. Yes, I see a more constrained vision than many others who comment in this space. And maybe you agree with me. Basically, they are presuming that they could have more control and influence than they can.
Absolutely.
They're presuming that they can envision and think through things more than they can. And I'm trying to find a way that we can think about something and find any reasonable choice to make that would have a positive effect. That's very hard.
I would agree. It's like the Heraclitean river is like, what are you just going to make it go straight up? Like, no, you're not. You could have a tiny trajectory tilt in it, but it seems to be unfurling in a particular way. And we're not making all these rules here. Like, we have to play with this game. But like, what I guess I'm getting at, Robin, is when I talk about that, what it implies, quite frankly, Robin, is like, it's not going to be hominids steering the ship for eternity, period. The eternal hominid kingdom is not one of the, so there's selectable options maybe, but really not. There's like tiny bends in the trajectory. So we can bend the trajectory. No trajectories ultimately end in a trillion-year hominid kingdom. However, Robin, most people on the internet and most people walking around in real life would presume it is possible and morally best if it be an eternal hominid kingdom. When I articulate these things,
but they're not thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, I guess
they're not thinking it through.
They're
just sort of expressing preference. Look, I got to say that most discussions of politics and the future are really just ways people coordinate on finding people who share their values. That's actually the social function.
I agree.
Hardly anybody really cares about the distant future. Hardly anybody even cares about the world politics. What they care about is sharing their values with somebody else. And so a lot of political and policy discussion is about sharing values. There's this huge way in which if you talk about concrete implementation or compromises you might be willing to make, people don't want to talk about that. So when people talk the future or politics, they overwhelmingly get sucked into arguing about values. I would say it's not very practical because there's all these other considerations they ignore, but I think it is effective given their preference for actually just bonding with people over values. That's what people want to do in these conversations.
Well, I guess I'll take it even to people I respect and have had on the show. Bostrom, Worthy Successor, episode 1. It'd be hard to articulate actually how much I respect Bostrom among living thinkers. Bostrom was really making the case for like maybe the AGI will just give humans Earth. And in, a million years, we can just walk the dog and we can, go to the racetrack and we can eat ice cream and we don't have to work anymore. And maybe that, and to me, like, I guess like it strikes me, Robin, that some people who are serious, like in the stages of grief, there's a stage called bargaining where you're sort of asking for impossible things. It strikes me that very smart people do like really weird kinds of bargaining as if Heraclitus's river is not moving. And so even smart people play some of this.
I find it very instructive to just take the example of imagining in past years, like 1500 or 1000 or 2000 BC. Just imagine that far back, you could maybe roughly guess the rough outlines of the future and ask, what would you have done then to change the future? What could you have done in 1500 or 1000? Even if you were the king of something, how could you have changed the trajectory of civilization, even knowing maybe that tanks would show up or bombs would show up or that, factories would show up? Even if we could tell you some key element of the future and say, go, help make the future better by doing something, it's actually really hard to think what they could have done. Once you realize that that's just the typical fact through history, you have to expect that's what's true now, right? We don't have that much more leverage or insight into the future than they did.
So I suspect you would presume, and I try to say this frankly, but again, Robin, I consider myself somewhat reviled for this opinion, and I don't know if you are as reviled. Like the opinion is, we must understand that as Potentia unfurleth into forms higher than we really are not going to be steering the ship and getting free ice creams for eternity in some guaranteed way. Nature seems to buffer those things out of the system, actually. And so maybe we find ways to keep ourselves productive in some symbiotic sense for as long as possible. But at some point we get buffered out, not because I like it and it brings me delight, but because I'm operating in the freaking world, man. And we need to think really about how the great flame expands, knowing our torch will one day go out. And in the way I say it is, marriage to any one torch is scorn for the flame itself in the long term. This is mostly a blasphemer's perspective that is really pushed back on. I guess I don't see people associating you, calling you a misanthrope, calling you horrible names, but you do hold this same opinion.
I've been called some bad names, but maybe for other reasons.
For other, other opinions you have, yes.
But I mean, honestly, in the world of, say, world politics and the future, there is just this strong slant toward idealism and optimism.
Yeah.
Right? That people have this norm that you should hope for the best, you should assume the best, try to make the best happen. That's actually a norm that people have in those fields. And what we're being is the usual cynic, perhaps, or what we'll call realistic about what's actually feasible. But you have to realize that's taboo a bit in those usual discussion worlds.
Yeah.
And then you can understand why. If I say the main function of that talk in those worlds is for people to bond together, then yes, we have a usual norm that sacred talk to bond groups together. It tends to be positive and optimistic. That's just the nature of sacred bonding talk.
Oh, okay. So to your point.
So you're just missing the function. You're in this conversation treating people as if they were talking seriously about the future and taking them literally there. And you don't get that. That's not what they're doing.
Well, yes. I guess here's the deal. I am painfully aware that my job is not the following: to get people to genuinely tell me what they think of the cosmic future. Instead, my job is this. My job is to get all their implications of what grand future intelligence would be and the kinds of values they're interested in, and then wait until the anthropocentric cope comes in, such as, so let me tell you the anthropocentric cope. It normally comes in the form of, and surely then all the future intelligence will love the humans. That one drops on the table. Or, and surely then they will give us the earth. That's another one. So my job is to lay out their thoughts in more objective sense, wait for the cope, Robin, and then put the cope in front of their other suppositions, and then just kind of sit there like this and just kind of watch them fumble with it, because I know that they have to do a perception management game. But to your point, going one level deeper, sometimes like they engage and start in the philosophical discourse kind of presuming, wait, aren't we going to do a feeling good, thinking forward, feeling warm thing?
That's what people usually do.
Dan, what is this nonsense you're doing? This bullshit. Like, hold up, buddy. I came here to feel fuzzy, you scoundrel. So what you're saying is many conversations start with this general intellectual. How did you describe it? People engage in conversation in order to, how did you say it?
Bond together.
Yeah.
Over shared values.
Yeah. Oh, man. Well, when you're a cosmist and not anthropocentric, you don't fit in that shared values bucket very well at all, do you?
I don't know if you know, but over the last couple of years, I spent about a year studying the sacred, like a bit before we talked last time.
I was not aware per se of it.
And so that was my attempt to make sense of this thing that was strange and getting in my way. And so, but now that I understand it better, I can see how it functions here. Yes.
Oh, man.
So,
lay it on us. I literally can't wait to hear this. Like how do you see the sacred fitting in?
I will try. I mean, we have lots of things to talk about, so I don't want to take too much time on it. But the key idea is I collected, I think, 68 correlates of the sacred. Just what people say, go along with it in order as my data to understand it. And I collected these into seven clusters, which have 7 rough summaries of, features of the sacred. And then I looked for theories of the sacred, and Durkheim's theory of the sacred, which is the sacred binds groups together in order to, have via their shared view of something sacred. That explained 3 of them, but not the other 4. And then I added a element of psychology called construal level theory that, combined with Durkheim's theory, will explain the other 4, and therefore have a rough theory of the sacred, which basically says we see the sacred together, the same to see it together. So the sacred is basically something that we choose to see together in the same way so that we can bond together in order to be a bound group. And it's important that this thing we see together, have some value elements, and we have to value it, and it has to be above us and grander than us and the sort of thing that, makes us feel awe. But then its function socially is to bind us together. And so, yes, world policy and even the future is often sacred to people in this way. They're using the future, say, as a way to bind together. And then what they're trying to do is have a shared view of it, that they can see it the same together. And it's less important that the view is true than that it be the same. So if there's a sacred tree in our world, and we like to go stand next to the sacred tree and admire it together, the thing that bonds us to the other people in that group is that we are the only people who get that that's a really special tree. And that binds us together, even though somebody in that group could betray us and we'd still feel bound to them because nobody else gets that that's the sacred tree. And we will still help them out and do things with them because it's really important to us that that is the sacred tree and we are the people who see it. And if nobody else sees it, they are just lost compared to the other people with us who see the sacred tree and get that it's really special. And it's actually being special isn't very important. What's important is that we see it as such.
Oh,
God. And we will change how we see things in order to see it the same. Yeah. So there are ways in which we are predictably see things differently, and we suppress those ways so that we will see it the same. Because the important thing is to see it the same.
Yes.
And so, for example, in our society, we treat medicine as sacred.
Go on.
And it's a way that we bind together through the shared view that medicine is very valuable and medicine is really wonderful. And in order to do that, when you're sick, you might see medicine differently than me because you're in the stress of actually being at risk of, say, dying.
Yeah.
That might make you see it different. And therefore, we might have a conflict over medicine. So what happens is you see it from afar, as if from afar, even when you're close, in order to see it sacredly, so that we will, in fact, share the same view of medicine. And that's, in some sense, why people won't actually look at their own medical diagnosis and their treatment plan. They just say, I trust my doctor, and I'll do whatever they say, as a way to continue to treat it as sacred. And by treating medicine as sacred, that's bound our society together. We subsidize it to an enormous degree, and we think the world owes us a debt of gratitude because we gave medicine, sacred medicine to the world, and the world is so much better because we gave it this wonderful thing. And that's why we're great, and we're great because we see this thing together and see it as wonderful, and that's part of it's sacred in our society.
Yeah, well, it strikes me as, Robin, like, you have classic kind of conservative stuff of like, having your 7-year-old have an AR-47 or whatever be sacred, and or like, on the other side of the political fence, men being able to enter women's boxing contests if they identify in a certain way being sacred. And so you have these sort of like you had said, people will choose to see things different. There might be some conservative folks who kind of of their own intuition, they're not necessarily convinced, every kid should, maybe they got an interest in soccer instead of shooting, but sort of to make sure you're part of that milieu, you will start to see it as crucial. Or maybe 2 years before you would have said men and women should never be in the same boxing ring. But as you see the tide shift and who you want to be close to, maybe it makes sense to say, hey, that's a her now, and let them fight, right?
So you're pointing to the fact that these views about what's sacred are changing rapidly in our world.
Yes. And
have been changing rapidly for a while. And that's one of the problems causing the problem we talked about. So I talked about how there's this problem we have with a proximate, symptom of fertility decline, but it's a deeper problem. And this fact of rapidly changing culture is, in fact, causing this more fundamental problem. It is the more fundamental. So we could talk about that now if you want, but you have a list of questions.
Yes. All right, so we'll poke into some other things. I want to double click on open inquiry, and then I'm going to double click on consciousness just for fun. So open inquiry. By this, I presume what you are talking about. So what the skeptics, back to like a Sextus Empiricus would say, is that the skeptics are always seeking. That is to say, there is no point that they arrive at what is a river, or what is this force, or what is psychology. There is always a constant seeking. And obviously with Baconian science, that turned into then kind of inquiry that would be tested, shaped, molded into paradigms, built upon, etc. When you say open inquiry, what precisely do you mean? And I guess broad enough terms where entities beyond us could do it, Robin. So how would you describe it in those broader terms?
Well, a thing that's happened in human cultural evolution is we've collected more tools and skills for sharing inquiry.
Yeah.
Science is one part of that, but it's only one of many parts.
Go on.
And there's this book about esotericism that I blogged about a while back. I don't remember the name, but the key idea is that up until a few centuries ago, when intellectuals talked among themselves, they did so in an indirect way so that the public and, say, the king couldn't figure out what they were saying because they were afraid of being repressed by violating the, official dogma of their society. And it was only in the last few centuries that many intellectuals have just been willing to say straight out clearly to the world what their opinions are.
Absolutely.
That they have been developing. And then
Absolutely.
they are part of a conversation where they criticize each other and build on each other and, refute each other. And that's been a way in which we have figured out many things. And then we have developed more specific methods and styles for particular topics. So like there's a sense in which, say, 500 years ago, everything was philosophy, and then new disciplines spun off as particular groups of people managed to find new ways to talk to each other in concepts so that they could share a discipline. And so in some sense, philosophy is now the leftover category of all the subjects that no particular other discipline wanted to take on.
It. Yes.
But still, this whole world of inquiry has lots of ways in which the different disciplines, build on each other. And there's polymaths like me who sort of float between them and help combine them.
Yeah.
This is just a rich ecosystem of thought that we share together that the world didn't really have before, because we didn't really have these specialists in topics who could speak openly and share across large scopes.
Yeah. And would you presume that there's any version of the world? So let us say, Robin, that potentia, the great total set of powers that persist, that allow the thing to not die, that the thing could be an ecosystem intelligence, a grand intelligence, whatever. Do you expect there's any version of that that's 1,000 times more grandly, generally capable than man, yet shares not the value articulated? In other words, maybe the access to nature happens always within closed circuits, and it's not actually being passed around in kind of a more friendly and open way. It's sort of like individual agents very much maintaining their own ever-growing understanding of nature. Is this what you would see as like a non-exemplification of that value in a post-human world would look like what?
Obviously, the only reason ever to pursue any value is the fear that it might not otherwise be supported. So, obviously one thing is I fear extinction, where just all advanced life goes away and never goes away. And so I will want to prevent extinction in order to promote this value. But then you might say, assume that we grow to be vast and big.
Yeah.
What's the chance that this value won't also be pursued? I have to say, well, if I were sure that it would be pursued sufficiently, there would be no reason to promote it, right?
Yeah.
It's just guaranteed. So anything you love, the only reason to promote it is the fear that it might not exist if not for your promotion, right?
Yeah, well, I've in previous episodes, like Sutton has 100% confidence AGI would be conscious if it was built the way that he would design it, and also articulated as one of the things he would hope the grand future would include. But to your point, I think you're bringing up an important distinction. Yes, if you value something, it isn't self-evident, and I think that is probably the right way to think about it. So I like where you're going. So it sounds as though, because it seems to me, Robin, that a lot of the progress we've made has had to do with open inquiry. Like, in other words, this Zoom call and, a bunch of other things seem to have been built off of a greater sense of, so Spinoza would call them adequate ideas. So an adequate idea is an idea when acted upon promotes more of your power than when you act on a stupider idea, an inadequate idea. So adequate ideas seem to have bubbled forth in great measure due to this open inquiry of which you articulate. But I guess what you're suspecting is there could be a trajectory, maybe from a different civilization, that could blast off where really, it is really powerful, but that sharing spirit goes away.
Okay, if we look at economic growth, a substantial part is caused by technical change and innovation and business practices, but there's also this world of intellectual ideas and academic discussion. Academics like to take credit for all this business and tech innovation that they don't deserve. If academia went away and stopped doing abstract discussion, business and technical innovation could continue nearly as well as before. So when I talk about open inquiry, it's about these abstract discussions, not accumulating technology and business practices.
Okay.
Because that could continue and would continue even without the open inquiry, because that's what happened in the past. Rome was a vast and powerful empire, even if it didn't have that much open inquiry, because, the economy and technologists could and did innovate and develop things.
So you're saying you don't they may have revered Athens, but not really done what Athens did. They did a different thing. They did an organization thing. They did a military thing at a greater scale, and maybe they lost some of that. So for you, this is a very important distinction. Open inquiry for you, as you're articulating it, is not the instrumental value of that which adds to our potentia and ability to act and directly be adaptive, which is what adequate ideas are. They're ideas where you're more fucking powerful when you act on them. What you're saying is, room for this. Now, I often think room for this grander abstract thinking is valuable because often nuggets shine forth that allow us to open up new paradigms, that open up new magazines of power. But what you're saying is, even outside of that, Daniel, I value it for almost kind of like its own sake in some regard. How would you describe this?
Yeah, I don't think I have very precise language for it. I think there are many abstractions that are not very practically useful. Certainly there are some abstractions that are, which is great, which is a reason to hope that they would be found and continue. But in a world that pursues many practical things, it may well not pursue the abstractions. And that was in part because often some abstractions conflict with, ideologies and shared treasured beliefs that people want to have. That is, I especially treasure open inquiry that can challenge and disagree with shared treasured ideologies and sacred beliefs.
And it seems to me, Robin, that an intelligence ecosystem that does that would be more adaptive in that it could challenge its own stupidness and come up with higher and better paradigms.
There's a lot of trade-offs on both sides, so I can't.
All right, no, I'm with you. All right,
obvious,
valid point. All right, cool. So good to know. It's a very unique value that hasn't come up before, so I wanted to double click on it. Robin, I want to touch briefly on consciousness simply because it's come up so often in these conversations. You just brought up a great distinction about what people value. You'd advocate for a value if it isn't self-evident that it will exist in the future. That's what a value is. I've had people like Bostrom, Sandberg, Levin, other folks who you'd know, say, Singer, of course, really, like, all things considered, if it was grand and complex, but had no sort of inner experience in any proximal way like we do, maybe that would be lost. So somebody might say if it was grand, complex, powerful, and maybe even had open inquiry, but there was no experiencing thinker to have said open inquiry, it was just happening in some sort of like inert way in terms of a lack of experience, that this would potentially be a loss of something. Do you concur with that opinion or have a different take on consciousness and its relative import in terms of future intelligence?
To the extent I can imagine unconscious creatures, I have the same immediate reaction most people would be, ew, right? I mean, of course, it's hard to imagine in some sense, but okay, if I can imagine it to the degree I can, yet it's not an attractive image. My opinion, most fundamentally, is that we will just never have any more data than we do now about this question. That is to the extent you think of the processes that create and support consciousness as separate from ordinary physics and having no input into ordinary physics, so that looking at any physical processes will never detect it. That's sort of this hard problem version of consciousness, account of consciousness. Then nothing we ever see will ever tell us any information about this. All we will ever have is our priors about which things are how conscious. And the entire future will be based on, arguing over this. So I do think that when there are conflicts between different kinds of creatures, one of the ways to disparage and insult a kind of creature will be to claim that it doesn't have consciousness.
This is amazing. And
a way to support your group is to say that it does. And that's just going to go on eons.
Oh my God.
For eons, that'll happen.
Oh my God.
We could have been doing that now. We could have said that people of other races don't have consciousness. We just didn't play that card. But we could have been doing that for the last 1,000 years or the last 10,000 years. We could have been accusing our enemies of not being conscious. And there's nothing anybody could ever have proved otherwise. There'll never be any data about this. We'd have no more data now. We'll never have any more. It'll just always be this open claim that some things, even though they have all the same behavior, are not actually feeling anything.
Yeah. There are people like Levin and Boyden who I would consider to be in the non-idiot camp who do have hypotheses about how to get boots on the ground within systems that we believe to have an inner field of awareness and aim to proxy out some of this. But I guess what you're saying is we're just not going to know.
There's no such thing. There is.
Yeah.
That is, if you have a theory of consciousness such that there would be some physical interaction between the conscious stuff and the ordinary physics, then you actually can just recurse the thing and say, well, why do you think that other thing is conscious? Because you could just lay out the same structure of it and claim that it wasn't conscious. So they're just, physics as we've understand it, is a bunch of things that interact, and the way you figure out about things is through their interactions. You only ever know about any physical stuff via how it interacts with other things. If it doesn't interact with anything, you have no information about it. So if you postulate the consciousness has no interaction with, no causal effect on the physical stuff we know about, then there's no way to learn anything about it. If you do postulate that, then it's just another piece of physics for which you could say, how do you know that's conscious?
Yeah, I guess here's two different thoughts people have had on the show. One is, look, if it's freaking complex, it's doing all the complex stuff, let's just kind of fucking presume it's going to have the trait of conscious, because we're not going to know. Like, it is what it is, man. It'll be as conscious as anything else is. That's one take. A second take would be, hey, potentially some degree of merger and symbiosis where we kind of get some knitting together here of what's going on upstairs in our skulls with these systems maybe would allow us to feel like maybe we'd be slightly more likely to end up with something that actually has an inner field of awareness through a bit of that path versus completely just throw Blackwell chips or whatever's after Blackwell chips in a big enough set of football fields and just let her rip with some nuclear center somewhere. That maybe we'd be slightly more likely here than there. You may say both are equally as likely if it can do the same functional things in the world.
Some people have a prior that a brain more like ours is more likely to be conscious. Like some people think if it's not made out of carbon, maybe it's not conscious or whatever, right? So or if it's not a neural net, it's not conscious. Or if it's digital, it's not, right? So people have these priors. I don't have much confidence in any one prior.
Me neither.
As a social scientist, I would more say, look, if there's a creature in your world that claims to be conscious and has some social standing, the polite thing to do would be to accept its claim of being conscious.
Whoa.
Right? Like in our world, if somebody claims to be in pain, we can't look inside their head to check whether they're pain. We say, fine, you're in pain. Like we will just let you take that stance and treat you that way. That's just a way to be respectful of the people in your social world. So I think as a practical matter, whatever AIs or whatever are in our social world and that we are treating them with modest degrees of respect, it'll just be polite to treat them as if their claims were true, that they were conscious. They claim they're conscious, fine, they're conscious. That'll just be the default social stance.
When I think
now, you have outsiders that you're hostile, the enemy over there, and we're all supposed to hate them and say how bad they are. Well, then the default thing will be to say that they're not conscious.
Totally. Well, I guess I would see there's a difference between, hey, in general, don't throw curse words at your chatbot and all the robots around you, just like in principle. But then there's also like, hey, maybe there's a false positive here of we think these things are carrying the torch beyond us, but like, actually, there's no movie going on. And I guess maybe what you're getting at is, Dan, maybe there's another distinction. One thing you said is a value is something you don't know if it's going to persist in the future, but maybe you can have some wield over it. What you might also say is, Dan, yeah, like if you don't have any wield over it whatsoever, then you shouldn't even consider it in your values. And because consciousness is so ephemeral and you are essentially completely pessimistic that there be any progress whatsoever, we just got to kind of drop it. Like, don't talk about it. Listen to things. If they say they're sentient, let her rip. I mean, like, that's as good as we're going to get. And in other words, it's not even a value we can fight over because there's no influence to be had here.
So when people talk about which humans are valuable, there have been, in fact, conversations in the past where we say aesthetic judgment is a important, valuable thing of a human mind. And then they've said there are these people so stupid, they don't have it. So people have in the past claimed that some humans have more moral value because they have an ability to perceive important aesthetic features of the world that other humans don't. And they call, those people barbarians or crude, various words for crude people. Basically, this has long been a concept of the sophisticated aristocrat or the civilized person or however you want to call it. Yep. In human history, humans have often made this distinction. The aristocrats have often said those peasants out there, sure, they're alive, but they don't have the kind of value of life we have because we appreciate Shakespeare and they don't even know how to read. Yeah. So they are less valuable than us. That's actually been a common stance, right?
Yeah.
But they could have just said they're not conscious. But, that was just too abstract or maybe crude to do. But they could have always been doing that. And who knows? How could you prove otherwise? Maybe consciousness only appears after you've had 10 years of education and can read Shakespeare. Otherwise, consciousness doesn't exist until that's created. What do we know?
Yeah, so I guess like safe to say of your, you would like the process that goes on beyond us to be autopoietic, in other words, to do this constant degree of natural selection, which is not limited to just the substrate of biology. That's one. You would advocate also for open inquiry to be a substantial part of that and to remain not just in an instrumental sense, but in a kind of joy and beauty unto itself. And maybe you could tie it to some adaptive things, like in my opinion, like I've said, I think questioning paradigms from kind of funky angles for fun is often a way to just literally find more adaptive ways to do it. But to your point, That's another thing. It sounds like for you, consciousness not even on the list necessarily, because it's like, what are we going to do about it? Is this the right assumption of kind of your perspective?
Right. Now, if you had strong confidence in these priors that many people do that say only carbon could be conscious, then you might want to, as an action, make sure all the creatures in the future were made out of carbon because, hey, now they'd be conscious. But if you don't actually have much confidence in those, well, then there's not much point in going to all that trouble. So honestly, I can't find any heuristic about which things are conscious versus not that I have enough confidence in that I would be willing to take policy actions based on. Maybe I will in the future. I could keep an open mind. Maybe you could show me some argument for some belief about these correlations, but I don't see it yet.
It strikes me that it would be worth striving for them. You opened with, man, I think the same way you do. Like, man, if all of that complexity be unconscious, I kind of go, ooh, like you had said that. It seems like if that be true, seeking for a foot in the door of if an inner movie be playing could be a worthwhile kind of pursuit, given the fact that the whole cosmic light cone is what we're duking it out over here. So would you say, hey, Dan, maybe it's kind of neato that a guy like Ed Boyden gets some money to try to work on this? Or would you say, honestly, he's wasting his freaking time?
I mean, I think it's great to have grand ambitions, even if you have low chance of success. So I'm open to there being lots of funding sources that pursue different strategies, and I don't have to approve of all of them.
Got it.
I did go to a conference mainly on consciousness 2 years ago and listened to, 2 days worth of talks, and I just wasn't very impressed.
Yeah,
I gotta
unfortunately,
say,
nobody
I didn't
is.
say that these people were making any progress, but hey, maybe in the future they will.
It's one of those. Well, maybe it's like one of those things you just talked about with the AI breakthrough. It's like, here's what a consciousness theory is, right? And once you've had 55 of them, then you assume the 56th one is probably not gonna be the breakthrough. So. Either way, that's good to know where you stand on conscious. Let me move into second to last question here with you around how we would know if we're moving closer to the kind of intelligence that you would hope to be able to be. You've used the word descendant, which I think is a perfectly fine and wonderful word here. Grand descendants that are carrying forth not only this unraveling set of, you said natural selection a lot. I think about the expansion of potential. I presume we're just using different language, but you don't seem to be pushing back on my analogy. So the expansion of potential we would hope to continue, hopefully with open inquiry as a beating heart part of that. As we move forward, and AI seems to be getting stronger, maybe some emulations or brain-computer stuff starts happening as well. How do you sort of get a sense for, is this system that seems to be getting more powerful, is it likely to actually be able to continually unravel more and more potential? And is it actually likely to continue the value of open inquiry? Like, what are the signs along the way that would tell Robin Hanson, I think we're moving in a good direction? So
far our lives have been short, and therefore we only really ever get to vote on the next generation or two of humans and what they do. And that's perhaps enough. That is, if I'm not going to live that far into the future, there's not much point in me having an opinion on how I would evaluate stuff, 10,000 years into the future. The choice I will have is between the next generation or generation after around me and deciding which of those seem more what I like. So I think that has happened in the past, and that will continue. With, say, brain emulation or forms of immortality, it becomes more possible to imagine some creatures lasting much longer, and then maybe creatures later would want to bring back somebody long ago and say, what do you think of this? It's not that they're going to do exactly what they say always, but they would want to know, what do people from long ago think about these creatures we're making today? In what way do they think they've fulfilled their hopes or fears? Or, that would be a useful thing that will happen plausibly more in the farther future. And I might want to be one of those. But I don't know that I'm going to have much sort of abstract, description of what I care about. I think I would more just see what I see and decide whether that's why they would bring me back, right? If I had a formula, they wouldn't need me.
I think you've got to be adaptive enough for them to want to conjure you, which maybe means lifting
I
your.
think there'll be a small niche for just what do the ancients think of this thing?
Yes. And if Robin Hanson is counted
we had a
among
few
the
ancients around now, I would bring them back to ask them that of a question about some of the things we have.
I wish I could talk to Spinoza and Emerson on a daily basis. Okay. So I guess I'll frame it in a different way. If let's say we're 5 years farther into AI, BCI development, civilization hasn't collapsed yet. Cross your fingers, Robin. And we're maybe not cracking all economic activity, but you are seeing a real chunk start to get taken out of certain places. And maybe it seems like we're going beyond LLMs in a way that feels promising in terms of capabilities. When we're there, how will you sort of scratch your chin and look at that evolving system and ask, is this the kind of tech and overall global kind of network and system of wielding that tech that feels likely to continue to unravel potential and feels likely to maybe even have some of this open inquiry value within it? Let's just say in 5 years, 10 years, we're there and it's way more capable. What will show you, whoa, this might actually lead to what I'd like, the things I, as Robin Hanson, think are important.
So we've talked about adaptiveness before.
Yes.
And how our current civilization is at risk of becoming maladaptive and declining and being replaced by another one.
Absolutely.
And in that context, I value adaptiveness, and I would like to find a way to be more adaptive, even if it is a little bit strange or changing in directions I don't like. I really value adaptiveness. So I would like our human civilization to become more adaptive over the coming centuries so that it doesn't decline. So that
what are the
we
biggest
have more
signs for you? Like flagposts?
Signs of maladaptiveness? Fertility decline.
Yes. Okay. Got it. So signs of adaptiveness for you would be people have more babies. Now, maybe the Western world has more babies. Maybe countries with a certain GDP have more babies. Who are you going for?
I actually think we have an understanding of the process that produces adaptiveness, and it's got 4 key parameters, and those are the parameters that have gone bad. So if those parameters got good, I would just have confidence that, okay, we're on a good track to adaptiveness. So that's the key. Since it's harder to judge if any one particular behavior is adaptive relative to just seeing that the process is working.
What are those 4?
So let me go through quickly. So natural selection is a process who we think about improving things, but its first task is to make things not get worse. So think of a control problem like driving a car. There's parameters in driving the car that will mean either it works well or not. You're on a road, you're trying to stay on the road, right? So imagine how clear is the road in front of you, how wiggly is the road, how fast are you driving, how fast is the connection between in your head and turning the wheel and the tires, and how bumpy is the road, right? All these parameters, you can see there's a regime where it works fine. You're going slow, the real road is turning slowly, you can see it really clearly. You just follow the road. It works great, right? Now turn all these dials to the other side. It's really dark, you're going really fast, the road changes really fast. Well, now you're probably gonna go off the road and crash, right? That's a control problem. It has parameters where you can control well versus not. Natural selection is similar. It's a process where there are control parameters, and there are 2 levels of cultural evolution. There's within culture and between culture. And the problem is at the between culture level, where there are fewer things because each culture is a thing and there aren't that many cultures. So the 4 key parameters can be illustrated from 3 centuries ago. First one is variety. 3 centuries ago, there were hundreds of thousands of peasant cultures around the world. Second parameter is selection pressures. These peasant cultures were near the edge of survival. They suffered frequent pandemics, famines, wars. If they weren't healthy, they got selected out of existence and replaced by neighbors. Second parameter. Third parameter is how fast is the environment changing? 3 centuries ago, the world doubled every 1,000 years, a slow change, slow enough that adoption could keep up with whatever changes were happening. And the fourth parameter was the internal rate of change of cultures. They were very conservative. They didn't like to change much, so they weren't changing very much internally, which allowed the process to work. So think of the process of natural selection is there's a high-dimensional space. There's a section in the middle of the space, which is the adaptive region. There's a cloud of points near that adaptive region. And the key process is points in the region, the center, they grow and multiply. Points outside of the region, they shrink and die. And now this region moves and these points move. And the challenge is for some of the points to follow the region so that the cloud follows it. That's the control process of natural selection. So you can see centuries ago, human cultures were successful. Hundreds of thousands of points, strong selection pressure, slow rate of drift, slow rate of change of the cultures. It was all set up so that it worked. Now, fast forward to today. Over the last 3 centuries, what's happened? We first merged peasant cultures into 100 or so national cultures. Then we merged those into a single world monoculture, so a vast reduction in variety. Secondly, selection pressures are way down. These few remaining cultures are just not dying off due to war and famine and pandemics. Third, the rate of change of the environment is much faster. The world economy is doubling every 15 to 20 years now. That's the rate at which this needs to track the adaptive region. And fourth, each culture is now changing internally very rapidly. That's what we were talking about before.
Yes.
We went from a world of conservative cultures that were trying not to change, and now we have modernist cultures that are eager to change. And we've got strong cultural activists who are trying purposely to cause large cultural changes. All 4 of these parameters have gone bad. Plausibly meaning the remaining cloud of few points are not tracking the adaptive region, i.e. we're drifting off the road. Yeah, that's the basic story of cultural drift.
This is compelling as hell. Super compelling as hell. So my presumption with
So just let me say one more thing.
Oh, go ahead.
If we develop AI in the next few years, it will still suffer the problem of cultural drift. AI doesn't automatically solve this problem. And so the answer to your question, what do I most want to see about AI?
Yes.
I want to see that it avoids the problem of cultural drift. I want to see it having a better chance than we do to solve this problem.
Would this involve a grand preponderance of various and sundry AGIs in different
You'd
places?
like a variety of AGI cultures, not just one monolithic AGI culture. You want a variety of different AGI cultures with selection pressures on them and, able to track the rates of change and not so eager to cause cultural change like we have.
AGI cultures. Man.
Yes.
Just if you were going to nutshell that for the audience, I'm using an analogy of human cultures into AI, and it feels goofy to me, but you have something you mean in your head when you say AGI cultures.
So
paint for us
the
that.
whole vision of AI is just to imagine a single brain independent of its culture. And that's been this image of humans, you see. The whole spirit of inventing AI has been this idea that all that matters about a human is their brain and their ways of thinking, ignoring the fact that, in fact, real humans live in cultures, and cultures are a big thing of what makes humans functional. So imagining AGI without a culture is imagining a quite dysfunctional version of a human. You should always have been thinking about AI in a culture, because that's what makes humans powerful. Culture is humanity's superpower. Big brains allow us to have powerful culture, but without culture, our brains would not be doing us so well. Yeah. So AGI also needs a culture to function, but then AGI also has the problem of having maladaptive cultural evolution. This is humanity's Achilles heel. We have made all these processes. We have water processes, and we have, drug processes, we have food processes, we have air quality processes, we have military. We, humanity, have made all these different processes to make us go forward. But there's this one key process we have not paid much attention to and is very fragile, is just the process by which we acquire our values. Our values come from this random cultural evolution process, and we have not been paying attention to this process. We have not been managing it or watching whether it goes bad. And AI needs a process like that because it doesn't have any other place to get its values either, just like we do. All it can do is get it from a culture.
Yeah, I mean, an implication of this seems to me to be is like there is a kind of infrastructure upon which the flame can expand. So the flame being the total expanse of potential. And this is from the adaptive, these 4 adaptive factors you've articulated. Now, I'm very interested in this model. I'm going to read a hell of a lot about this after this interview. But these 4 adaptive factors you've articulated, there's stratum of this that are essential for more adaptiveness to bubble forth. And to me, adaptiveness is not just like, I stay alive longer. It's like powers expand. Adaptiveness is a flatworm turning into you. That's adaptiveness to me. So it's expansion of potential. So what you're saying is there's an infrastructure that actually allows that to happen, which we've neglected. We paid attention to water and water quality. We've paid attention to, other components of civilization, but we've kind of turned off to this. Robin, what would it take to make people care about this? Because when I hear you, I agree vehemently. And I also think to myself,
you have to get them to see that they are in this process. That is, when we start to talk, so we talk about the future policy questions. The first thing everybody does is they think, what do my values say about this question? Yeah. And everybody assumes my values are this anchor I can just rely on and trust. And I will use my values to evaluate AI or global warming or Trump or whatever it is. Almost all discussions of politics and the future are based on this sort of framing. What do my values say about it?
Yeah.
Now, this is getting you to say, these values are not so reliable. You can't trust them. In fact, the process that makes them is broken. Culture is humanity's superpower, and we broke it. And we weren't paying attention to breaking, and it's still breaking, and it's been breaking for centuries, and that's how bad we are. We didn't, over centuries, notice we were breaking our superpower.
Goddamn, Robin. So Rachel Carson wrote the Silent Spring and sort of woke people up to like, whoa, maybe certain chemicals at certain maybe the whole ecology, like there's actually a thriving set of networks.
There's a system we rely on we might be breaking. That's what she was saying.
What I'm interested in is, what is the clarion call, as she did, for what you are doing? Because what you're saying is almost, it would seem to me, we would have to change human nature or make everybody love inquiry as much as you do in order to make this flick on.
Rachel Carson and other people like that could say, there's this system we rely on, i.e. nature. We've been breaking it because those evil people have had the wrong values, terrible capitalists.
Carson wasn't that. So the people that turned into the EPA and all those other things, they were more politically, I think Carson actually, to her credit, this is the reason I respect her, was less tribal jumping in, making bad guys. She was more like,
but that's what got the world to care.
You are right.
You
are absolutely right.
By herself, her book would not do it.
I commend her for her virtues, but to your point, the adaptiveness was actually the tribal brutality of what people latched onto. Was like the gory,
because they could frame it as, I have the right values, those other bad people have the wrong values. This is a problem of the value conflict. Those people want to destroy nature because they hate nature and they just want to get rich, and that's all they care about. I care about nature, so I love nature and I'm going to help protect it. That was the thing that got people to take on Rachel Carson's observation about harming nature.
Yes. So to your point, her level-headed assessment of the state of things, which may not have been politically tinged in any grandiose way, had to be politically impinged for it to catalyze into action, which to me feels really disappointing. But how am I going to escape it? That's how the world works. So now we come back to your perspective. You have an infrastructure that's important, Robin, and I think you're actually bringing up something more people should talk about. How would it be, God, I hate to say this, how would it be dumbed down and tribalized enough for people to take action on it?
I've been working a lot on different solutions. We have limited time here, but I can point out one. It could be politicized in one of two ways.
Let's hear it.
One way to politicize it is to say, this problem is greatly reduced if the world becomes more capitalist or libertarian, because that, makes a lot more competitive pressures happen. And yay for us fans of capitalism and libertarianism. Okay. Right. That's one way to politicize it. Another way to politicize it is the return crowd. What went wrong with the world is we left the good culture of 1800 and we've introduced, women's rights and all sorts of other things. And the solution is just to go back to the old good culture that we used to have. So there are some people who like that, maybe roughly as many as there are libertarians, but it's still a small group, right? Most Republicans aren't like that.
No,
few Republicans want to go back to the culture of 1800, but they at least think we're changing too fast, too much, and they're right. So certainly, if you say one of the things Republicans or the conservatives have said for a long time is that we are changing culture too fast, too easily, without knowing what we're doing, this says they were right. Doesn't mean that doing what they say will help now, but it means, okay, good for you. You were right.
Oh my God.
Okay, but I have a better solution. I have just barely enough time maybe to explain.
Go ahead.
So as you know, I've invented this better form of governance called futarchy. Vote on values, bet on beliefs is the slogan. We don't need to get into its mechanics right now, but the key idea is it's a candidate for a much more competent form of government. And it's a form of government of the form you give it a goal. You give it a measurable goal that you can see after the fact, and then it will just very effectively achieve that goal. And now, if we just gave it the goal, prevent civilization collapse, it would do it. Except as soon as it started to demand sacrifices for us in the name of this goal, we say to hell with that and we change the goal. So we need a goal that people wouldn't give up on once they needed to make sacrifices for it. So it needs to be a sacred goal. We talked about the sacred a bit before.
Yes.
Okay. So now we need a sacred goal that happens to be inconsistent with civilization collapse. If people could commit to that and actually achieve it, it would prevent civilization collapse, at least if it was feasible. What goals could be feasible and inconsistent with civilization collapse? Well, such as, when do 1 million people live in space? When do we achieve physical immortality for humans? I did polls and these came up near the top as the sort of goals people thought they could feel as sacred and feel committed to. So the key point is, if we set up a futarchy, a system of government that's very effective at achieving a stated goal, and we gave it that goal, some goal like when do 1 million people live in space, that happened to be inconsistent with civilization collapse, because it'll take a while, and if civilization collapse, it'll take a lot longer. So the goal is to make it happen sooner. Then, in fact, this very competent form of government would, in fact, try to figure out, how do we achieve this? It would induce substantial changes in order to do that. We would look at those changes and see them as expensive and troublesome. But because it's a sacred goal, we would be proud of the sacrifices we make in its name and ashamed to abandon it. And that's the key thing that might let it keep going and achieve its goal over 2 centuries, perhaps, of preventing collapse and therefore, causing our civilization not to be replaced by alternatives, but to actually no longer shrink and grow and overcome its current maladaptive tendency. But it would only be feasible, presumably, by some pretty substantial changes. And we would notice those changes and we would find them troublesome and painful and costly. It's only if we frame them as a worthy cost to pay for a sacred goal that we would tolerate it and keep it.
Yeah, I mean, this lever on the sacred, I think, is really, really interesting. And I'm going to be, again, reading a hell of a lot of this after this interview. You brought up some things that were sacred, like, I don't know if it was human immortality or exploring the stars or some shit like that.
Well, right. Those are things that could be seen as sacred. That is, I asked people, could they see it as sacred?
Yes. I wonder, Robin, is it possible at all that the unraveling of potentia and the continuance of the grand process of life, of which you and I are merely part, would be seen as sacred? Or if this is not seen as sacred, because when I look at most hominids, I say
no.
Yeah, no, right. Exactly. It has to be anthropocentric. The sacred is going to have to be about
But it
monkeys
also has
getting
to be
more
somewhat
bananas.
concrete. To function in this role, it has to be tied to a relatively concrete. The sacred tree is a concrete tree in front of us.
Yes.
It can't be the abstract idea of a tree.
Of course.
It has to be a concrete sacred tree.
So
here it has to be some concrete thing we are producing in the world around us that we would treat as sacred.
Yeah, but I guess what you're saying is, let us set up anchors that are monkey-friendly. In other words, they smell like, ooh, more bananas, right? Let's set up concrete trees that are monkey-friendly, that carry us in a cosmic trajectory, but you got to move the monkeys, and you ain't going to do it by talking about philosophy. Am I getting you right?
Yes.
Well,
I mean, maybe some future AIs could be motivated by the abstract philosophy. Certainly not the humans we see around us.
No. The bulk of humanity.
We need to move the people we see around us, and they are moved by much more concrete, abstract things.
You got to. The monkeys want to mate, and they want more nanners. And if your narrative can't get them those things, well, good luck. So to your point, a deep understanding of the sacred is actually crucial, and then a careful calibration of what's considered sacred and ensuring it's aligned with a greater adaptive process, what I would call the expansion of potentia, would be sort of the way to hopefully avoid the trough and ensure the blooming on some level.
Right now, it turns out the sacred isn't actually that complicated, so you don't actually have to understand that much about it. But until you understood the sacred, you didn't really know that, so you had to go in and figure it out what it really was. But it turns out to be relatively simple.
That's good.
But it still has some constraints, and so if you're going to use it, you have to satisfy those constraints, and that's what I've tried to do in the story I just gave you. But I want to admit that I just gave you a pretty long shot story. So if this is my best story, I have to admit we're kind of screwed.
Oh man, darn it, Robin.
The default scenario is we just fail, and that's what I have to admit. Given this is my best solution and it's pretty iffy, then yes, the default is we fail, but we should still try.
So the default is we fail in the sense of civilization collapses before any kind of tangible blooming of potentia could occur? In other words, the flame diminishes and turns into embers before it can turn into a blaze in the cosmos.
I mean, the rise and fall of civilization has just been a very consistent feature of human history. There's no particular reason to think our civilization will be an exception to it.
I'm with you.
But there's no particular reason that humanity can't rise again after the fall of the civilization. So it's not the end of the flame. It's just the temporary diminishment.
Yep.
But it does, if it falls and then rises again, it'll be whoever is in that new civilization that rises again that gets to make the choices about AI or M's or whatever it is that, or space colonization, whatever it is they do. If we don't do those things, we don't get such a voice in what they do. That's the payoff. If you want to influence what happens with these technologies, you have to be there. Somebody that represents you has to be there when it happens. And that's why you have to be tied to something adaptive. So that something like you will be there to have a voice.
Completely, yeah. You have to uphold your own values through the adaptive. You have to stand in Heraclitus's river and deal with it if you want your values to exist somewhere. I'm with you there. So, well, I guess we're sort of ending on a bit of a daunting note that sort of some of the forces we're facing are pretty monumental. Some of the forces of adaptiveness, the infrastructure that undergirds us in this adaptive greater process, and you've highlighted the importance of culture. We just don't appreciate it, and we're letting it collapse. It's almost like Carson never wrote the book. We all just started literally drinking straight up like pollutants, and like nobody even rang the bell about it, right? So it's almost like that is happening for the adaptive things that undergird civilization.
There was a sense in which before Carson, maybe we didn't need to pay much attention to it. That is, pollution was relatively mild up until before then, and maybe it was the sort of thing that could get away with ignoring. Maybe just about then, it was starting to be the sort of thing that was hitting harder if you ignored it, and was time to not ignore it.
So is it possible, in closing here, that we are coming up to a point where we will watch adaptiveness crumble at the edges, and there may be a resurgence, or maybe not, maybe an initial surgence, that's not a word, of people caring ardently about the pillars of adaptiveness that undergird society, because now it becomes evident it actually matters, just like what you said with Carson. Is that hypothetically possible?
Although plausibly, this cultural drift problem I've talked to you about has been the main cause of cultural civilization collapse in the past. That is, pretty much all civilizations have risen and fallen, and this may in fact be the mechanism that's caused it in the past. So it may not be a new mechanism, actually. It just may finally understanding what was actually causing all the collapses before.
Yeah.
So, but it still would say civilization will keep rising and falling until we figure out what this problem is and find a way to get around it. Otherwise, we will face the rise and fall. In fact, over the last 2 centuries, say, people have looked at our rise and projected it forward. And I have to say, I'm quite guilty of that. I thought, well, it was reasonable to project the trends over the last 2 centuries into the next few centuries. And now I have to say, well, maybe not. Maybe we're going to face a fall here like the past civilizations have. And that stretches out the timescales here. It says, okay, this takes longer than I thought. It also means we have less influence than I might have thought on these stages we can foresee that might be past what we can do.
Yeah, if we, like you said, if we be not there to birth when things can pop off into the cosmos, well, we have no say at all about what's going to be going on, open inquiry or otherwise. So I guess, Robin, in so much as an individual fella can try to put a clarion call on the importance of the greater adaptive process, I'm trying to do just that. And hopefully you've given our thinkers and listeners some tools to think through what's important in the future as well. I know that's all we have for time, but Robin, it's been a real blast, and I appreciate you being back.
I'm happy to talk again sometime.
Absolutely. All right, so that's all for this episode of The Worthy Successor. A big thank you to you for tuning in, and a thank you to Robin Hanson for being able to join us for this episode. Many of the opening questions for this episode, by the way, were chipped into the comments ahead of the episode's actual recording. I'll put a couple names up on screen here for those of you watching the video of people who contributed questions that were directly asked in the episode. Moving forward, I'm going to be doing a lot more of this before I interview guests. I found that like 1 to 2 days ahead of time, asking for good questions will almost always give me between 2 and 4 questions I didn't think of that could be a lot of fun. So big thanks to our commenters on Twitter that sort of chipped in ahead of time. If you're not already in touch on Twitter, make sure to check me out at Dan Fagella. I'll put it up on screen here. But very much appreciated some help with that prep. I want to be able to dive into some of the reflections from the episode with Robin, and I have my notes on screen, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of reading here and diving in on some of the things I wanted to touch on that I'm reflecting on. First and foremost, I think it would be hard for me to agree more, actually, with a lot of Robin's ideas on the idea of natural selection. Often when people say natural selection, I presume they're talking about necessarily biological processes taking place through, gametes exchanging as they do in biological systems through biological sex. But Robin meant the more open-ended notion of sort of entities becoming more fit over time in order to adapt to emergent circumstances and to expand their total set of powers. I use the term potential a lot in this episode. Robin seemed to sort of concur with me during the episode that that's kosher and sort of congenial with what he meant. I use my own lingo. He used his own lingo. But his ideas around natural selection I thought were really, really important. And I think rightly, he places a lot of preeminence on sort of maintaining a system that is adaptive. Whatever it be, it ought to be adaptive. And he sort of placed that extremely high. Less emphasis on sentience than almost anybody else we've talked to. That would have to be really a lot to be said there. I think he's extremely pessimistic about the likelihood that we'll crack consciousness. I hope he's not right, but he might be. But his ideas about natural selection, I just agree with wholeheartedly. He talked a good deal about this notion of the sacred, why it's very challenging for human beings to question certain categories of belief that they've sort of locked into a sacred position, that have become kind of fulcrums to a greater set of beliefs for that particular set of humans. For some people, the relationship with their spouse is sacred, or children is sacred, or their God is sacred, or country is sacred, or whatever the case may be. But his main point is that sort of there are huge blind spots that open up when we sort of append ourselves to a cluster of belief and make it an unquestioned pillar of the rest of our worldview. And I think the way he explains sacredness is really cool. I actually read some of Robin's views on sacredness afterwards. If you type in sacredness Robin Hanson, you'll find some of the articles on his own blog about sort of that topic, which I found to be really, really fascinating. The key sort of takeaway from this in some regard is, number one, getting people to think about the worthy successor is, of course, extremely challenging because we are butting up against some rather sacred notions about the eternal importance and the eternal existence of Homo sapiens sapiens as the main character of the entire cosmos, which, of course, upon rational reflection, is a really an unreasonable and ridiculous idea, but without rational reflection, is a closely held sort of sacred belief for which many blind spots are hurled forth. And Robin rightly mentions most people are not having even intellectual discourse to get closer to any proxy of truth, but to sort of exchange good vibes, make themselves feel good, maybe have an interesting time, but definitely not question those things that they'd prefer not to question. I very much concur with Robin's conception of human nature outlined in his sort of Elephant in the Mind book. Again, he doesn't use the word conatus from Spinoza, but that's the lingo I come from in sort of ethical or sort of psychological egoism. I think Robin's general frame there of sort of individual and collective human action and sort of the action of agents in the world is really, really, really strong. The implication for his idea of sacred is that we could not set a star in the sky, a North Star, that says, hey, we ought aim to ascend. We ought to have cosmic moral aspirations to sort of unfurl and unfold the magazines of potential to keep this great project of life alive and open up new kinds of sentience and other kinds of goods for which we have no present idea. This is far too abstract. To his point, the sacred must be extremely concrete in order to, let's say, marshal human will en masse. It is something that we all choose to see in the same way, which means if we is a large number and see in the same way is what we mean literally, then it's got to be pretty damn simple. That presents, as Robin highlights, and I think this is really important, and it makes me a little bit more pessimistic about my own project, the idea that sort of the cosmic is sort of beyond human conception. It is not going to be something that people most likely rally around. We would have to set anchor points that are human accessible and seemingly tell a story that's beneficial to humans if we are to move people in the direction of creating the flourishing of the greater process of life, in addition to the flourishing for just man himself. There's a lot of wisdom there. There's a lot I'm going to be writing about and thinking about there, but I thought Robin's idea of the sacred was extremely important and really unearths a lot of what makes conversations like this very challenging. And including, I read some of your comments where you're like, man, I don't like thinking about some of these things, but some of you sort of push back and are a little bit angry about it. I presume probably won't watch any future episodes. That's okay. For others, you say you're challenged, you say it's uncomfortable, but you enjoy watching them. You've seen 5 or 6 of them. So I certainly hope to keep more of you around to question some of your own sacred beliefs. I hope to question any of my own sacred beliefs, frankly. I hope to be man enough to do that. And if I don't, I hope in the comments you will beat the heck out of me. With that said, last comment on Robin's interview. He puts a major focus on the fact that we might be kind of hitting a trough as a civilization. In other words, demographic trends, other sorts of institutional decay may not be really giving us a sort of, let's call it, infinite span of time to decide what trajectory we want to set. We might have a small bit of influence to influence the trajectory a bit, to sort of break through to something that hopefully is good, after which we'll have likely almost no influence over the grand trajectory, and that we might not have that much time to have that breakthrough. In other words, technology and trajectory selection may have to happen much more near term than people would be comfortable, which is a big part of the reason I'm having this conversation about the trajectory of sentient intelligence right now, as opposed to, once we solve AGI safety, then we think about that. Over time, through conversations with a few close friends, I've become more and more convinced, unfortunately, that within a decade, never mind 2 or 3, we may be sitting on a much weaker institutional foundation for, let's call it, general global progress in terms of sort of the functionalness of our civilizations and the belief systems they run on, than maybe even we have now. And now feels pretty damn precarious, if I do say so myself. So Robin highlighting that, I think, is crucial. And I think it is actually one of the reasons we have the worthy successor discussion now, because it isn't self-evident that there isn't the option of a trough if we don't have a takeoff. There is growth and there is decay. There is no stasis and middle ground. And I think Robin is more frank about that than almost anyone. And that is, I think, one of the things I appreciate most about Robin. If I end on this note, Robin, and there's a few other people, I think Yosha Bach generally fits this bill. Robin may be the top exemplar of this among the people I follow on Twitter. Robin's ideas are sort of captured by no one. There is no camp he's loyal to. There is no belief that I think with sufficient evidence, he wouldn't himself kind of critique and look at it in a new way, even if he liked it before. I think Robin is working on a project of ardently chopping down his own sacreds and looking at things sternly, and is owned by no tribal narratives. For that reason alone, he's interesting. For all of his robust study in these various fields and his experience in thinking about the future of AGI and intelligence, I think he's also rather useful. So I hope you found this episode useful. Really grateful to be able to have Robin here. Our next episode is with another philosopher and thinker, more focusing exclusively on the topic of sentience and consciousness. Robin didn't have a lot to say there, which is fine. He had a lot to say about other interesting topics. If you're like, oh man, I'd like to hear more about consciousness, well, you're going to want to stay tuned for episode 17 of the Worthy Successor series in just about 2 weeks. So stay tuned for that. I look forward to catching you here on The Trajectory.